All right, so what I'm going to talk to you today about this world of analysts and the ability to help them with us with our data modeling tasks. So about me, I've been working with data and analytics teams for around about the last 8 years. Sometimes I go in as an agile coach where I kind of help them change the way they work. Sometimes I go into an organization and help them select and implement a new modern data platform. And the third thing I tend to do is work on our startup around combining agile and data. So I have quite a bit of experience with teams when they want to start moving data modeling out towards the analyst community, and some things that work and some things that haven't worked so far. So if we think about the supply chain, the way people work at the moment, in terms of the teams I work with, I kind of see two patterns. I see a pattern where there are some requirements done, it's handed off to some data modeling people or roles, the model's done, it's handed to the engineers or the ETL developers, we used to call them, and from there it's handed over to do the visualization. But we're seeing kind of a second path arrive all around this idea of analytics engineering, where we go from requirements to actually building code and straight into the visualization. And depending on the organization, sometimes we see the analysts do the visualization, or sometimes we see that as two different roles with a handoff. So if we look at that first path, where we go from requirements to modeling to development, the typical thing that happens is the requirements get handed over and the modelers thinks, right? They look at the requirements, they look at how the organization is structured, the way data flows in the organization, and they think about the model that they need to create. And then after they've worked out what good might look like, they produce some diagrams, right? They produce a conceptual and typically a logical model to say, this is how we should implement it. And then that's handed over for development. If we look at what happens with the kind of alternate path now, the way I liken it is analysts and analytics engineers are jumping straight into the kitchen. They're effectively going in and just grabbing all the data ingredients and starting to build without really thinking about the model. And what do they produce? Well, they tend to produce bunches of code. And with some of the tools we've seen, like dbt, the code can produce some form of model as a result of the code. But over time, we end up with lots and lots of code and lots of different modeling objects. And we get kind of this big map that may be organized, it may be logically structured, or it may just be complete chaos. So why are the analysts not doing the modeling that we've been taught to do for the last 20 to 30 years? What are the barriers that are stopping the analyst community from actually modeling first before they start creating their code? Well, if I look at it, I think the first thing is there's this perception of data complexity and perception of complexity around modeling. If we look at, when we create a model, it tends to be, and especially when we're looking at an enterprise-wide model, we tend to create lots of things, right? We're thinking about all the different processes in the organization. But a bit like the London Underground, if I'm an analyst and I just want to go from, say, Notting Hill across to Bethnal Green, I'm just going to write code that takes me from that beginning to that end, right? That's the task that I have been told to achieve in the short amount of time I have it. And then if I'm going to go from another station, I'm going to go and build my data to go from that station to the next station. And over time, I get a map that may be well organized, but typically it's not. So they're kind of encouraged to take the short path rather than sit back and map out the data across the organization. The second thing is we often get told that the data has a relationship of one to many. There is only ever one payment for an order, but we've all got experience where we know that the data breaks our rules on a regular basis. A second payment turns up for that order. And we use terminologies like duck feed and many to many and one to many. And that's a complex thing to understand, both from a modeling point of view and when we look at the data. I think the other thing is we have this perception that data is messy and complex because some of it is, right? And that's the ones that as modelers we always worry about. We worry about those edge cases. But if we think about, the Lego diagram that we're seeing flying around Twitter, we can take this messy data and then we can sort it and then we can arrange it and then we can present it and group it and then we can figure out how to use it, right? So there are ways that we've been taught to do this. And we kind of want to encourage our analyst brethren to do that as well. The other thing we do is we have this idea of party and party entity. I tend to call it thing of a thing of a thing, right? We model data in a way that makes sense to us as we model. But if we bring an analyst in, this thing of a thing has no business context for them. So again, it's some of the complexity in what we do in the modeling world that's hard for an analyst to understand. I think there's another barrier, which is the complex language we use in the modeling world. Shared language is really, really important. And if we don't have clear language, then it gets confusing. So if we look in the world of Agile, we've got lots of terms that we use, XP, BDD, user story, Kanban, Scrum. It's the same if we look in the data world. We have SED type 2, we have anchor modeling, we have activity modeling, we have this new reverse ETL or data activation, right? We have lots of complex terms that anybody who wants to model has to learn. And we make it worse, right? We had the world of big data, and I could never work out which of these was a Hadoopy big data thing versus, one of those characters off Pokemon. I still can't. So again, we make the language complex for some reason, and that causes a barrier for analysts to be able to model. The other thing is we need to be really clear when we're modeling, when we're naming things. The number of times I've worked with organizations where we've discussed the definition of active customer, and we end up with a marketing active customer versus a risk active customer versus a financial active customer, because each of the rules that we use for that active customer is slightly different for good reason. But we get taught that we can't call it the same thing, right? We always put that word in front, so we differentiate which of those things we're actually reporting on or we're creating data for. And we have a perception that every organization is unique. And while, the Great Wall of China is unique, there is no other. There are lots of walls in the world, right? There are lots of barriers. So sometimes things aren't unique, right? They're customer orders product. There's a lot of things that is reusable and patent-based that we can do. And then sometimes there are things that are unique that require a modeler to sit there and do some thinking for some time to solve those unique problems. The last barrier, the third barrier, is we introduce complex handoffs into the way we work, and we've seen that get worse over the last couple of years, in my opinion. So we've seen a lot of hyper specialization, right, where we've taken roles like an ETL developer and we've decomposed them down into a series of roles that hand off to each other. So we've seen data engineers, and then we've seen analytics engineers, and we're about to see metric engineers. We'll see ML ops engineers. So they start doing small steps in that data supply chain and handing off to each other. And again, that makes it complex if you're in the modeling, because you kind of can't see across the whole, all the steps, because you're only one small cog in that entire process. And if we look at technology, every now and again, or every day, there's a new product out, right? It's hard if you're thinking about modeling about which tools you use and where they fit. And, we've now got this idea of a modern data stack come out where there are some common patterns of putting stuff together. But a lot of the time, the modeling tools that we need to be able to model well are not available in the stack. There's a massive discussion right now on LinkedIn around, modeling. Do we need to do it? Have we lost the art of modeling? What tools can we use? Where does it fit? So again, we have complexity of tools and platforms that we have to integrate ourselves rather than having them integrated out of the box. So how can we help analysts model? How can we make them as good as we are? How can we make them, the best in the world, like that particular rugby team that just happens to come from a small little country down the bottom of the world called New Zealand? Well, for me, I'm a great fan of patterns. I presented last year around this idea that we can have things that we do that within a given context, they have value. And those patterns, if we could describe them, enable other people to pick up that way of working or those solutions and check whether their context is the same and whether that pattern is going to help them. So when I think about patterns, I think about 4 types. Organization patterns, so kind of team structures. Are we decentralized? Are we centralized? Are we working together? Are we working in a way that we have handoffs? I think about process patterns, the way we work. Are we flow-based? Are we working in iterations? Are we self-organizing teams, right? A whole lot of things around that. I think about technology patterns. How do they work together in terms of our technology? And I think about our ways of working. How do we put all that team structure, that process and that technology together and craft our own way of working as a team? So I'm going to focus on a pattern around process and a pattern around technology that I found particularly useful for enabling our analysts to model like we do. So when we look at the way we deal with data, I kind of say there's three approaches we can take. We can take a data-driven approach. That's typically source-specific. So the data turns up from the source, we start looking at that data and we model directly off it, which is what we see a lot of the analytics engineers doing these days. Another approach is report or model-driven. So we either create a model first and then populate it, or we take that real fast path for the London Underground, where we've got a report and we model the data just to populate that report and get no reuse in the future. But there is a third approach, right? That third approach is called business process driven, where we look at the organization and we use some plain language to understand the core business processes. And then that performs our initial model, and then we figure out how to get data to populate that model. So Lawrence Core has a book out called Beam, Business Event Analysis and Modeling. I'm a great fan of Beam. I've used it for many years and coached many teams to use it with great success. And the way it works is we start off by asking a question of who does what. And we ask the business users to give us a story. So we'll typically hear customer orders an ice cream from a store, at a store from an employee using a promotion code on this date for this dollar value. And as an analyst, we can really easily have those conversations and effectively start pulling out the business model out of the organization. And so we'll end up with terms like who does what of customer orders product. Now, when we do that, we can effectively break that down into three types of elements. So the first thing we see is we hear as an event. We hear this customer orders product, the who does what, or customer pays for order, or store ships product. The second thing then is each one of those becomes a concept. There's a concept of a customer, there's a concept of an order, there's a concept of a product. And after that, we get some detail. We get the customer name, the customer date of birth, we get the product name, the product SKU, we get the order ID, the order quantity, the order value. And within Beam, that's a really nice way of taking that business language that we've got and breaking it down into a business model or a conceptual model in my head. One of the great things about Beam is Lawrence has already mapped it out to how you take a Beam model and you make it into a dimensional model in terms of DIMs and facts. For me, I'm a bit more of a data vault bigot. So for me, I map it across to data vault. And so in data vault, we have this concept of hubs, a concept of a customer. We have some satellite which hold attributes about that hub. And we have links where we see hubs together in a relationship, customer orders product. So funnily enough, we can map it across. We can see an event maps to a link, concept maps to a hub, and detail maps to satellites. So that's a process we can use to gather requirements from the business and then map it into a model that we can implement. The other thing we've seen is technology solve this complexity before. We no longer have people moving the wire to take our telephone calls. So there's this whole movement in the world now around Figma for data. This idea of creating collaborative workspaces for modeling. And for me, in terms of our startup, we use Figma a lot, but I differentiate when we're using Figma to build our application, which is unique, versus Figma for designing our website. I don't want a website design, I actually want a website. So for me, we look at something like WordPress. WordPress now powers 40% of the web. In terms of websites that are generated. And everybody says, well, that's great, but WordPress is really only useful for really simple sites. It's not used for anything complex. But if we look at it, here's 4 websites, right? Microsoft's website on the top left, the AWS below it. On the top right, we've got Snowflake, and down below, we've got dbt. 2 of those websites are created using WordPress. 2 of them are created using handcrafted code. Have a guess which 2 you think are WordPress. And the answer? Well, actually, the Microsoft and the Snowflake websites are highly complex and beautifully designed, but they're built using WordPress. And then the AWS and the dbt ones are custom. So we do see some complex stuff being done with tools like WordPress. And why do I like it? Well, for me, I can design on the right-hand side within WordPress and actually build at the same time. So while I'm designing, I'm building. I'm not having a design done in isolation and then trying to figure out how to physicalize it, how to actually make it real. And that's what we should be doing, I think, when we talk about allowing analysts to model, giving them tools that allow them to model first and then build those flows of data that they need. And so we've been experimenting with that. So I thought I'd just do a quick show and tell on the way we think about it. So for us, the first thing we think about is there should always be a catalog of your models, right? You should always see a way of understanding what's been built before so you can reuse it. So for us, we think about this idea that each one of these tiles is a table or a view that may have data, it may not. And then we think that for analysts, we should be highly opinionated. So we think that actually some of the choices where it doesn't really make a difference, that we all argue about, dimensional versus data vol, we should take a stance on that. So for us, we take a stance of a persistent staging area, which is our history tiles, the grey ones there. And from there, we start to move into the idea of events, concepts, and data, right, which I've described already. And so that's effectively how an analyst will model. And then at the end, we have consume, the purple tiles, which for us are denormalized tables of views that we use in our reporting tools. So Power BI or Tableau or Click or whatever you want to use to go and query it. So as an analyst, what do? Well, I go into design and I have a look at a thing called a topic canvas. And for us, we think about topic canvases as subject areas, as domains. We know that as we model data, it becomes big and complex, and we need a way of subsetting it so we can concentrate. So as an analyst, I think, I should be able to go away and create a new canvas. I give it a business term. So I might call this one ICE sales, right? So I'm saying there's actually a topic or a domain in my organization is around that. And once I've got that boundary, right, I've kind of got a place that I can do my domain, I should then be able to grab concepts that have been used before, right? So I should be able to go and search and say, well, what else has been modeled, right? Or there's customer. And that one's Shopify customer, and I don't really like that. I don't think I'm dealing with customers from Shopify. So I'm going to go and call this one sales customer, right? And as you'd expect, we're going to have a problem in a minute because now we have two definitions of customer, which we'll have to deal with later. But right now, as an analyst, I'm thinking that's what I want to do. So I'm going to go and grab the who, who's involved, the customer is, and what do they do? Well, they're going to order. Yep, there's an order there already. I'll go grab that. And what do they order? They order product. Cool, I'm happy with that. But there's some other events, right? As I'm talking to the SME, I'm hearing some other words. So I go and create a new event, and in this case, they say there's some payments involved. And I go, okay, cool. Who's involved? The same customer does it, okay, and what do? They pay for something, right? Okay, well, we don't have any payment. So again, I'm just going to really quickly create a new concept of payment. And it's not a who, it's a what. And then I'm going to drag, and what do they pay for? Well, they pay for an order. And then we'll typically have a conversation and say, oh, actually, do they pay for an order or do they pay for a product? And we can have a conversation around that when we're doing this kind of business modeling. And so as an analyst, we can keep going until we've captured all the understanding of the organization that we can get out of those people's brains. Now, we've written some terms down there, and we may change those later, right? We may harden up some of those terms around what each of these concepts are. But under the covers, what we're doing is we're building a model. And one of the things we did was we experimented with this idea of using these little network maps to display it. And I found them too complex. And so what we did is we said, well, what happens if we go back to a tried and true way of visualizing a model? One we've had in the data warehousing space for years, the old bus matrix. And so in this case, what we've got is down the page, we've got our events, and then across the page, we've got our concepts. And where there's an interaction, we see a dot. So we can start seeing that actually now I've got a sales customer and a Shopify customer, right? Which may be the same customers. So I may only want to conform them later and have a master customer or a single view of customer. But right now I'm saying I'm going to take a shortcut, right? I'm not going to conform them. I'm going to go and push that data out to my stakeholder quickly to meet the value I need, and then we'll come back and deal with it later. So we've got a conceptual model, we've got a business model, right? But we have no data in it. So what we want to do is enable the analyst to actually do the next step. So we have this concept of rules, right, which is effectively like ELT code. And so why don't we take that next step in the WordPress world? Why don't we let them create the code that populates the model? So I can go in and add a rule. I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to say this is sales customer. In this case, I'm just going to populate the concept. So I'm going to go and pick some data up from my persistent staging. I'm going to go find the data that was sitting there, and I'm going to go pick the key. And in this case, I only want to create a concept, right? It's just a bag of keys, effectively. So I'm going to go and say that's the concept that I'm outputting. So take the data from history and then output it, and then go and pick the table that I just drafted, right? So sales customer, and just whack in a key. And now I want to go and preview that. So I want some validation, right, of what's going to happen if I run that rule. So what I'm going to get back is a bunch of keys, right? And ideally, I want to be able to write tests at the same time. We should all be testing our code. So again, as you know, the WordPress model, we should actually have a bunch of tests that we can apply. So in this case, I'm going to say, well, I want to make sure that the key is never null, and I want to make sure it's unique, right? So I want to get a warning if that thing comes back and I've got duplicate customer IDs, because that sounds weird to me. And once I've done that, I can publish it. And then if I'm in prototype mode, I should be able to run the rule, right? So I shouldn't need to go into yet another tool. I should just go in and say, run the rule, right? And that should run it. And in the background, that's going away and running the rule. And then at any time, I should be able to come and view the tile, right? I should be able to view the data that was populated. And we'll see how fast that goes. And refresh the screen again. And so that data should be coming through where I can actually go and see the data, right? That's being populated into the rule and validate it and see what I want to do with it. And again, right, we should be able to go and see the relationship of that data. So I should be able to go into, say, a concept matrix where I can see all my concepts and all the details that have been created and see that, you know, for some of our concepts like Shopify customer, I've actually got multiple satellites effectively under the covers. That's the choice I've made. So we're going to do that for an analyst. We don't have to have technology. Sometimes it's around process over technology as much as ever. So for the last couple of years, I've been using Miro to actually model with my business owners, with my subject matter experts. I just go and create a Miro board and I use stickies and I say who's involved, and you know, so up here on this side is the who and the what and the where, and then I've down there is who does what. And at the same time, I capture the business questions. I say, well, actually, what kind of questions do you want to answer when we actually do this work? And that's really important because we're seeing a whole world of metrics layers and semantic layers come back, the old universes of old. And so, again, we can use natural language in terms of the way we capture those business questions to help us validate our model. So if we say how many customers we have, we now know we have a concept of a customer. If somebody says, you know, what is the increase in number of orders placed in June, then we know we have a concept of orders and a concept of placement. We know we have some attributes around dates, right? We can actually start decomposing these natural language questions back to validate our model or build it. So what are the takeaways? I've actually had experience with analysts modeling, right? Using Vault, using dimensional modeling, actually using really no conscious modeling technique, just modeling. And if we train them in the right way, if we give them the right tools and capabilities, they can do it, but we need to reduce the complexity of the way we describe it and what we ask them to do. There are a bunch of patterns readily available in the world to help reduce the complexity and to help those analysts model. Some organizations, all the data in those organizations are complex enough that actually you do need specialist modeling skills, right? There are a bunch of places where you do need somebody just to sit down and nut it out to get it right. So my question to you is, how can you adapt your way of working so your analysts can do some of the modeling earlier and not wait until the data modeler's done it for them? And the way you do that is you concentrate on reducing the complexity and handoffs. You think about your organization and your team structure, the processes you use to capture those models, the technology you use to support your teams, and combine that with the ways of working to try and streamline the process and get feedback early, which is what it's really about. So, you know, my call out to you is let's start getting those analysts modeling. Let's stop them building what I call mad person's knitting, where we end up with 3,000 disconnected objects because they're taking the fast path to get the data in front of their customer to get that value. We can get there quickly as well while still modeling.